Welcome back to the History Fix. Last time we talked about Oliver Cromwell and the English Revolution, and our focus was on the outbreak of the Revolution and the Civil War. Today we're going to take the story up to the end of the revolutionary process, and I want to just remind you of where we are in 1645, 1646. 1645, the defeat of the King and the Royalist forces at the Battle of Naseby, and then within a year of that decisive victory by the Parliamentarian New Model Army, the last of the Royalist fortresses and armies have been suppressed. So the English Civil War comes to an end in 1646. Now, the thing about a revolution is this, that when you have a revolution, when you overthrow by force the existing government, in some cases it might be a government which has been there for decades, even centuries, you immediately pose the question, what is going to replace it? Is it just going to be another government made up of similar types of people? Or is it going to be a different kind of government made up of very different people? Or is it even going to be something much more than that? Is it going to involve profound economic and social change? All of these questions are posed by any kind of revolution, and they were posed in England in 1646 and also in Scotland, of course, because Scotland had played a central part in the revolutionary process as well. In fact, going right back to 1637, the whole revolution had really begun with events in Scotland. So what sort of world, what sort of England and Scotland is this going to be now that the king has been defeated? And there were really four different forces that were now in contention. There were still the Royalists there, the defeated Royalists, yes, but still a very powerful group in English society, certainly, headed by the king. He's still there, he's in prison, he's held in prison by Parliament, but he is still a player in the political process. Lots of Royalists who simply want to reverse the outcome of the Civil War. Then secondly, there is the majority in Parliament, and we call those the Presbyterians because most of them adhered to a view of church government which saw it as something which would be quite top-down and hierarchical, where you would have the church run by conservative elders, and that was something they thought appropriate because the Presbyterian majority in Parliament were essentially men of property, men with a lot of property, therefore conservative in terms of economic and social questions. They might have taken part in a revolution to overthrow the government of the king, but they were not interested in economic and social transformation. That's the second group in play, and what those Presbyterians are interested in doing now in 1646 is really making a deal with the king to establish some kind of constitutional monarchy in order to halt the revolutionary process, lest it get out of control. But there are forces in play as well who, in a sense, want to push the revolution much, much further. These are the middling sort, which we've been talking about quite a bit on the History Fix. The middling sort made up of yeoman farmers, rich peasant farmers, made up of the more prosperous traders and craft workers in the towns, men who had formed the basis, really, of the parliamentary armies, in particular the New Model Army. And the New Model Army therefore becomes a focus of the radical drive, the radical energy of these middle-ranking forces in English society. And the soldiers of the New Model Army, the rank and file soldiers, the ordinary soldiers, they elect agitators, as they are called, 2 for each regiment, to represent them, to form a coordinated voice representing the ranks of the army, to negotiate with their officers, and to put pressure on Parliament, to push England in a more radical direction. They are linked up with a new party, a new political party. They come to be known as the Levellers. The Levellers are very strong among the army rank and file, but they also have a base in some of the bigger towns, in particular London. So you have a levelling party of civilians linked up with rank and file soldiers in the New Model Army. The most important leader, I should say, of this movement is a former army officer, Colonel John Loban. That's the third force that in a sense is in contention to try and decide what sort of England we are going to create after 1646. The fourth element in this situation is represented by the army officers predominantly, and a minority of the more radical members of Parliament. We know them as the Independents, and that's because, unlike the Presbyterians, they favoured a much looser form of church government, where in effect each church community, each congregation was free to decide its own form of worship. But in sociological terms, these army officers and parliamentarian independents, they are sort of oscillating between the interests of the Presbyterian majority in Parliament, essentially a conservative force, and the radical force of the Leveller movement and the army rank and file. The officers are in a very interesting position because they are revolutionaries, committed revolutionaries, but they are also men of property themselves. Generally speaking, smaller units of property, smaller estates, smaller businesses than the Presbyterians, but nonetheless they have a stake, as it were, in society as property owners. On the other hand, they are very responsive, as particularly the army officers, to the pressure from below, coming from the ranks of the army. Now, this debate, because it's a huge debate which in a way is raging across the whole of English society for several years, this debate about which way forwards, what kind of government are we going to create, what sort of place is England going to become now that we have defeated the king. This raging debate reaches a kind of climax in 1647, when there is a great formal debate between the army officers, the generals, the grandees, if you like, predominantly independents, remember, in their broad outlook, and representatives of the army rank and file, representatives of the Levellers. We know these debates in October 1647 as the Putney debates, because they took place in a church in Putney, on the edge of London, as it was then. It's now been absorbed, of course, into modern London, but at the time it was on the edge of London. The Putney debates, in a sense, represent the first expression in British history of an open debate where the ideas of democracy are being advanced. Now, I want to give you a flavour of those debates, so I'm going to quote some of the things that were said, and it will give you a sense of the issues that were at stake in England at the time. This is Colonel Thomas Rainsborough. He was a representative of the army rank and file. He was a leveller, and this is what he said at the Putney debates. I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. The poorest man in England is not bound in a strict sense to that government which he has not a voice to put himself under. In other words, everybody, at least all male householders, heads of household if you like, were entitled to a vote. Here is Henry Ireton, one of the army grandees, one of the army generals, replying for the officers. No one has a right to a share in determining the affairs of the kingdom that has not a permanent fixed interest in the kingdom. That is, the person in whom all land lies, and those in the corporations in whom all trading lies. In other words, you're only entitled to a share in the decision-making process if you're a property owner, a big property owner, a big estate, or a big share in a business. Now, this debate was not resolved when the news came through that the king had escaped from captivity and he immediately started a second civil war. So, in 1648, the divided forces of the parliamentarian cause, the divided forces of the army specifically, they come back together again in order to crush this second royalist revolt. And when that has been done, the army officers are persuaded that it is now necessary to settle accounts decisively with the king. And there is what is effectively a second revolution. If our first revolution is 1641, leads to the outbreak of the First Civil War, we have a second revolution in the winter of 1648 and 1649. First of all with Pride's Purge in December 1648, where army force, military force, is used to prevent Conservative members of Parliament taking their seats. In other words, the Presbyterians are now excluded from Parliament, and the Long Parliament turns into the Rump, as we know it in history. In other words, only the members are left who basically are in agreement with the army officers, with the new model army. And then, immediately afterwards, the Rump Parliament puts the king on trial. He is sentenced, condemned to death, and executed on the 30th of January 1649 as a traitor to the English people. One of the most decisive events in British history, let me tell you, because it was at that moment, effectively, that it was decided that England was not going to become an absolute monarchy in the way that absolute monarchies were developing on the continent, and that was certainly what Charles I wanted. It was at most going to be a constitutional monarchy. That was effectively decided by the execution of the king at the climax of the Second Revolution. But having crushed the Royalists and the Presbyterians, having crushed the right in political terms, the army officers now faced a challenge from the left, a challenge from the emboldened rank and file of the army and the leveller movement. And this time, that conflict between army officers and army rank and file is settled by force. The mutinies which break out in the new model army are violently suppressed by the army officers. 4 soldiers are shot in a churchyard in Oxfordshire, for example. Brutal suppression of this movement from below for democracy, breaking the back, in effect, of the great popular movement which has driven the revolution forwards from 1637 onwards. The army officers now find themselves very isolated. They've crushed the Royalists, they've crushed the Presbyterians, they are bitterly resented by the propertied classes as a whole. On the other hand, they've crushed their own popular supporters and they've demoralised the popular revolutionary movement, so they wobble on a very narrow social and political base, and they struggle to create a stable government. They're not able to do it. So in 1653, they give up altogether trying to rule through any kind of parliament, and they establish a military dictatorship. The military dictator, of course, is Oliver Cromwell. What Cromwell, as Lord Protector, to give him his official title, what he goes on to do is to divide up the country into different territories ruled by major generals. So in effect you have military rule at the top and military rule in each of the regions into which the country is divided. And that regime holds on for a few years up until the death of Cromwell in 1658, but it has few friends, it's increasingly unpopular, it's increasingly unstable, especially following the death of Cromwell. He's succeeded briefly, incidentally, by his son, Richard Cromwell, but in 1660, it is a general of the New Model Army, General Monk, stationed up in Scotland, who decides to carry out a coup. So this, in a sense, is a coup by one part of the New Model Army against the other part of the New Model Army. He marches his army on London. He garners support along the way. He takes control of London, and then he invites the exiled son of Charles I to return to England and become king. So Charles II succeeds to the throne in what is called the Restoration in 1660, finally bringing the revolutionary process to an end with a kind of compromise between the propertied classes that had supported Parliament and the propertied classes that had supported the king in the Civil War. It's a compromise which, of course, excludes the vast majority of ordinary people, including the vast majority of the people who've done the fighting in the course of the revolution. I want to make one last final point before concluding this episode of the History Fix, and it's to say this. With a bourgeois revolution in which we see the replacement of one ruling class by another ruling class, an old land-based feudal ruling class being replaced by a new ruling class of improving landlords, of merchants, of traders, of bankers, eventually of industrialists, a bourgeoisie, if you like. If that's how we define a bourgeois revolution. Bourgeois revolutions have this characteristic. Because they are being made first and foremost by men of property, in the interests of men of property, you have a situation where the successful revolutionaries are torn by the situation that they create by carrying through a successful revolution. And that is that they unleash the possibility of far more radical changes unfolding. They have to do this because in order to find the power that they need to overturn the existing government, to smash the existing state apparatus, they have to mobilize mass forces from below. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you begin to mobilize these forces, you begin to empower ordinary people, and ordinary people's consciousness develops very, very rapidly. Their political horizons broaden, their political ambitions are awakened, and they begin to imagine a much more thoroughgoing transformation of the world than their leaders are prepared to countenance. So the bourgeois revolution has this characteristic. It mobilizes mass forces only to disappoint them and then to turn on them and crush them. This is inherent in any kind of revolutionary process where the people leading the revolution have an interest in an essentially unequal social order. Much further on in the History Fix, we won't be doing this soon, but as we move forwards in time, we will be exploring the nature of a very different kind of revolution, a working class revolution, a popular revolution from below, which is led by the ordinary people, and where complete human emancipation becomes an historic possibility. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.